going, fellow historians? Tony Keith here, welcoming you all to another episode of 5-Minute Flashback. It's getting pretty chilly now that fall is nearly over, which means that there's not going to be a lot to do outside. Me personally, once winter break comes, I usually like to sit back in the warmth of my house, fire up my Xbox, and play some video games. Video games have absolutely dominated the world over the past couple decades as one of the most popular ways to spend time with family, friends, or even on your own. Today, there are more ways to play than ever before. You can download video games on your phone, computer, or console, and you can even stream them. But how and where did this phenomenon all start? And how did it evolve over the years? Today, we're looking at a brief history of retro video games. First video games actually came from computers in research labs during the 1950s. Computers back then were much different than they are today, being much larger and way more expensive. The scientists in these labs began to try and program games that people could play. These early games began to grow interest, but they could only be played on these large computers. That all changed when Ralph Baer led a group of developers at Sanders Associates Inc. to create the Brown Box. Still a prototype, it was the first system with multiple games available to play with multiple people, all while being able to connect to your home television. Magnavox bought the rights to the Brown Box and released it as the Odyssey, the world's first video game console, in 1972. That same year, another company, Atari, decided to borrow one of the Odyssey's games and release it as Pong, which was actually the first arcade video game. Atari got sued for it and lost a lot of money, but their involvement in the fledgling video game industry was far from over. In 1977, Atari released their first video game console, the Atari 2600, which was a huge step for the industry. For the 2600 and other consoles at the time, games were sold in the form of interchangeable cartridges, which could be swapped out at will. However, this resulted in more consoles and way more game cartridges. There were simply too many options for consumers. Along with the fact that computers were now able to run video games, the sale of home consoles and cartridges dropped drastically by 1984. And it seemed that all hope was lost for the console industry in America. But while a crash was going on here, the next generation of consoles began in Japan when Nintendo released the Famicom in 1983. A couple of years later, the Famicom released in the United States, now named the Nintendo Entertainment System. This new console had improved 8-bit graphics and gameplay and was the birthplace for some of the most iconic gaming franchises of all time, like Mario, Zelda, and Mega Man. Nintendo also released the Game Boy in 1989, which was one of the most iconic portable handheld consoles. Other companies just couldn't compete with Nintendo's success, including Sega, but that changed when Sega released the Sega Genesis, which had better 16-bit graphics and performance than the NES. Nintendo countered the Genesis by making their own 16-bit console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, in 1991, and thus the first console war began. These two companies went head-to-head for the next few years, and the Genesis actually did better in North America, while the SNES did better in Japan. Soon, though, everything would change as new, more powerful consoles were on the horizon, and they could play games in 3D. This was a major step in the industry and would be the perfect time for a new company to come in and take over. Sony did just that when they released the PlayStation in 1995. This newer generation of consoles used CDs rather than cartridges to play their games, and the 3D graphics, although not good at all by today's standards, were still an absolute game changer at the time. Sega and Nintendo had their part as well, releasing the Sega Saturn and the Nintendo 64 respectively, but Sony had a much larger third-party support, so they were able to buy exclusivity for a ton of new gaming franchises. With these new consoles, the retro era of gaming was coming to an end, and the modern era was beginning. Nowadays, the next-gen consoles and games perform incredibly well, but looking back at the humble beginnings of the gaming industry, it's pretty amazing to see how far it's come. That's going to do it for today's episode and this season of 5-Minute Flashback. Do you have a favorite video game console? And are any of these retro consoles collecting dust in your basement? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next season.
This program was produced by ZTV at the University of Akron. Do you want to gain experience in video production, professional social media, or working with real clients? Visit the UA School of Communications online or follow us on social media to learn more. ZTV, make media, make a difference.